Hello and welcome to the Coaching Crowd podcast with me, Zoe Hawkins, and my friend and co-host Joe Wheatley.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode, which is all about questions that you can use in a pre-coaching questionnaire. And the reason we are sharing this with you is because Zoe and I use pre-coaching questionnaires with our own coaching clients and have done for many years. We find that they're a great accelerator of coaching, and they also help to orientate your coaching clients to the coaching. And there are lots of different questions you can use in a pre-coaching questionnaire. And we know that not everybody that trains as a coach gets given a pre-coaching questionnaire template. We do on our training programs. So what we're going to do today is we're going to share with you a few questions that you can use in that pre-coaching questionnaire, and stay with us until the end, because we'll also be sharing with you a link where we're going to share with you 100 questions that you can use in a pre-coaching questionnaire.
Absolutely. And just before we get into the questions, I just want to reiterate my love for the pre-coaching questionnaire. And we use quite an extensive one, don't we, Joe? And we have many people ask us, like, do your clients, like, really honestly want to fill these in? And on the whole, I would say my clients love the pre-coaching questionnaire because it really does get them into the mindset for coaching. And often clients will come and they'll be like, that was so revealing. Like, it was, I found that really hard, and that's really interesting. So I had one client recently who found that they were doing a certain thing as they were filling out the pre-coaching question. It really brought up a resistance for them. And so that became something that brought us into the coaching quite quickly around, so what's that resistance about? And it helped us to really refine those goals. So it's a really clever tool. And I couldn't coach without a pre-coaching questionnaire now. I probably could if I had to, but it's definitely not my preference because the quality of the work that I can do with my clients is so much stronger when we use the pre-coaching questionnaire, even if a client opts to not fill it in, because that in itself is data. So, yeah. So I just wanted to start by saying if you don't have a pre-coaching questionnaire, it's a great opportunity to listen in and maybe think about doing one. If you do have one, it's a great opportunity to think, oh, I wonder what else I could put in my pre-coaching questionnaire to make it even better. So, what are some of your favorite questions, Joe?
Well, we tend to have questions in the beginning of the pre-coaching questionnaire that ask the client really, like, how do they want you to be as their coach? What do they want to make sure that they get from the coaching relationship, and what impact will that have for them personally or professionally? So we tend to have questions around them really kind of stepping into the what's the purpose of this coaching for me? And I suppose I should need to do a step back. So in our pre-coaching questionnaire, we also use it as a contract, or, certainly supporting the contract. So we outline expectations of the client, expectations they can have of us, and then also some mutual expectations. So those questions I've just shared with you around what do they want to make sure they get from the coaching and so on, is really then them reflecting on that, having thought about what am I going to contribute to this coaching to make it a success for me.
I know. I think outright questions around expectations can be really helpful, even if you've set the scene. Like, what do you expect of me as the coach? What do I expect of myself as the client? Those can
Mhm.
be revealing questions as well.
Yeah, and you talked earlier on about resistance. So, you could include questions like, how do you want me to be as your coach when I sense you resisting?
Hmm.
A question, because some clients are going to want you to push, and other clients are going to want you to respect that. And I think that's part of the ongoing contracting that you'll do with your clients. So the pre-questionnaire does not replace any contracting conversations that you have with your client at the start of a session, during a session, but it really is helping to, as you say, Zoe, like, set the expectations, manage expectations, and orientate them to those first bits. So you can have a section around questions around how the client's going to be, what they expect from the program. And then we tend to have a couple of sections, one around questions related to the individual's professional life, and also some questions related more to who they are as a person and how they experience other aspects of their life. And the reason for that is because the style of coaching that we do is whole person coaching. Um, do you want to give some examples though of some questions related to the professional piece?
Yeah. So, I mean, the professional piece is fairly straightforward. So I would ask things like outline your, the highlights of your career so far. What are your standout moments? What are you most proud of having achieved? What are you motivated by in work? What takes away your motivation? And what you're really doing through these questions is not just reading what the client says, which is useful and interesting, but you're noticing how the client thinks. So, in the way that your clients fill out the pre-coaching questionnaire, you're looking at the language that they use, some of the statements that they might make, the way that they talk about the things that they do. So, if you're noticing your client saying try quite a lot, that's information for you. If you're noticing your client using what we call not what we call, but which are modal operators, I must do this, I've got to do that, I need to do that, then that's information, and you might sense a pressure kind of coming through. So the pre-coaching questionnaire, when you're using questions, it isn't really just because you want the answers to those questions. It helps you to form a picture of the way your client's mind works, and that is what's most helpful. So yeah, questions around what has got your client from where they were to where they are now, and how they see themselves. If you're working with leaders, how they might see themselves as a leader, how others may see them in their leadership role. You may also choose to ask questions around the relationships that they hold. Like, is there any conflict within your network that is a source of challenge right now? So you can, what's your decision making strategy? You could ask all sorts of questions.
Yeah, how would you describe your relationship with your line manager? Who are your closest peers? You may also choose to ask some questions about their goals in this section. We tend to have a section at the end around goals, but we do tend to ask questions about goals in these other sections that I'm talking about. And that can be helpful for the client just to see, is there an alignment here? Or often they don't realize they've got these goals professionally, and then they'll have something completely different at the end. And so, our role as a coach can be just helping to explore, what is that telling them? What does that mean for them? How does that impact the way we spend our time together in the coaching relationship? And that question around, what are your strengths? Or you might ask a question, what are your gifts or what are your talents? That is, I would say, certainly within the top 3 questions that people tend to not answer. So they'll often answer every other question, but that question tends to but for many clients, there's a resistance in that, not wanting to own or identify with particular strengths, gifts, and talents. And what we're interested in is that relevant to the gap between where they are now and where they want to get to, or what they want to achieve? So, when we're reading the information, we've always got that in our mind. So we'll look at their goals and we're reading it and building a picture of the client in respect of achieving that goal. I think that's a really important piece to bear in mind.
Yeah.
So there's some questions related to the professional bit, and they don't need to be differentiated in this way. We're just sharing it with you in this way to help give some structure to the conversation on the podcast today. So when it comes to more of the personal side, you might ask questions like, what's your life history to date? And that's where the client might give a bit more of a narrative. And Zoe's already talked about, noticing, or the client noticing actually, what are the things that come up for me when I ask myself that question? What are those key kind of visual milestones, that pop up? Because some people will think more visually, others will think, more in lists, for example, or just kind of random thoughts that pop up for them. And I think it's probably important to say here as well, not every client is going to want to or find it easy to write their responses to these questions. So you might want to think about checking in with your client. Would they find, reflecting on these questions useful? And if so, what would be the format that would enable them to get the most value from it? So it might be recording the questions on a particular app, which will enable the client then to be able to record their responses to those questions, or just co-creating a completely new way to do it together. So we've got, what is your life history today? What would you add into that list of personal questions?
Well, you sparked a thought for me just there around as we start to get into these personal questions, you wouldn't just drop this pre-coaching questionnaire into your client's inbox. You would explain to them what the pre-coaching questionnaire was for, what to expect when they receive it. It's an invitation to fill out. It's not, they don't have to fill it out or there's no coaching, because if you just send it cold and your client opens this up and they think, oh my gosh, I didn't realize, this feels much more like therapy. So it does need some positioning. And the other thing I'd say as we get into this personal space is you are not there for the story of your client's personal history, but that story is just information around how that can be relevant and connected to the goals that they are seeking. So your client shares their personal history. You're not necessarily going to dive into it. If they say, let's say they put in, I don't have a great relationship with my mum, but my dad has been a source of inspiration for me. You aren't going to ask, tell me about the relationship with your mum. Like it's not relevant. That's just information. But what is relevant is more looking at like what is the client sharing again, what's their language. So if they say, oh, my dad is a source of inspiration, you say, what is it that you find inspiring that is relevant to the goals that you want to achieve? So you're looking at where is the useful pieces of information. I think that's important, because what we wouldn't want is coaches going away from this and thinking that you then get into story-based coaching. That's not what this is for. So
just to be clear as well, the positioning is in the chemistry conversation. So when a client inquires about engaging in a coaching relationship with you, you would usually set up an initial, it's either called a chemistry conversation, some people call it a discovery call, and you're exploring, who they are, what they want from coaching, your style of coaching, your programs of coaching, the boundaries of confidentiality, and so on. Check if there is alignment. So you might share with them what your typical onboarding process is for coaching, and sharing the invitation to complete the pre-coaching questionnaire and share it with you in advance of that first coaching session that you have, and that what you'll do with it, which is review it, and it'll help you to kind of formulate the themes that you pick up from it and questions that you might want to debrief on together. So that's where the positioning piece comes. And then if they say, yes, I'd like to have some coaching with you, you would then send an email, and that would include the contract, the pre-coaching questionnaire, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think other questions that you could put in there is like, what has to happen in your life for it to be well lived? That's quite a thought-provoking question. What are the values that you hold dear that need to be honored in your life? You might ask questions around what the client is passionate about outside of work. What else would you add, Jo?
You might ask some questions about their beliefs, and it doesn't necessarily fall into, personal or professional, but you might want to just ask them around, what beliefs do you hold that have enabled you to achieve what you have so far in your life? Or you might ask questions around, what are the positive beliefs that you have, or what are the beliefs that are limiting you in terms of achieving your goal? Some questions related to that. And as you all know, we're very interested in people's emotional experiences. So do you want to share, Zoe, some questions that we might ask them about that?
Yeah. So in my pre-coaching questionnaire, I have a section on emotions where I ask the client, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much unresolved emotion do you tend to experience? And I list out certain emotions like anger, guilt, those sorts of things. And the reason I put that in my coaching questionnaire is because me and Jo do emotion-based work. So somebody comes and you might be talking about a fear of failure, and you might see in their emotion scores that they've scored fear as a 9 out of 10. That's going to get in the way of them achieving their goal. And so working on that at an emotional level can be really important. Now, not all coaches necessarily have the interest or the skill to be able to do that. So that's there in ours. And also talk about what's the relationship that you would like to have with your emotions. And I give some examples because they're not necessarily questions that they would have heard before. And it's absolutely okay if clients aren't sure how to answer that either, because that creates quite an interesting conversation in the debrief. And we'll talk about the debrief in a moment, actually, where a client might come and say, I didn't really understand what you meant by what's the relationship I have with my emotions. And we'll be like, oh, well, what would you say if, what came to mind? Well, I feel a bit disconnected from my emotions, if I'm honest. Okay. And to what extent does that influence what you want to achieve? Now you come to mention it, so it becomes an interesting conversation. So the piece I was going to say around debriefing is that the pre-coaching questionnaire doesn't just sit on its own. It is part, for us, it's part of the first session where we work through that with our clients. So we'll ask them, how did you find completing the pre-coaching questionnaire? What stood out to you as some question, as some of the questions that you answered? Did you notice any themes or patterns? So we give them an opportunity to share their experience of it. It's not just an exchange of documents and never referred to again.
Yeah, and interesting things can come out of that. Like, I've never asked myself these questions before, or nobody else has ever asked me these questions before. And even those types of responses can be very revealing for the client. And I guess thinking of going back to the emotions is thinking about some more everyday language. And I think that's really important to think about if you're creating a pre-coaching questionnaire is how does it relate to your style of coaching and the questions and the style that you have in your sessions? Because once you've had that chemistry conversation, some clients will have a strong reaction if they receive something from you that doesn't feel like the conversation that they had with you to start with. And that could create it. What we really want to do is for the pre-coaching questionnaire to be a valuable resource for your client and for it to really build on the experience that they had with you in that chemistry conversation. So around emotions, you could simply ask them, what are the emotions, what are 3 emotions that you feel most on a day-to-day basis? What are the emotions that you want to experience when you achieve your goal? Things like that. You might even choose to include an emotions or a feelings wheel. And you can get those, you can Google them online, or, obviously there's our emotions coaching practitioner training. Because a lot of people live their lives in a very narrow range of emotions. So they'll think about love and fear and sadness, and they won't necessarily be able then to kind of differentiate from, say, 50 emotions down to the top 3. It'll just be the first emotions that come to mind. So it can be very helpful to have some guidance in the front of your pre-coaching questionnaire, inviting the clients to respond with whatever comes to mind. That you're not going to read it as a coach with judgment. And again, reiterating what the purpose of the pre-coaching questionnaire is, because really it's a tool for the client. It is a tool for us, but really you want to design it so that it is most useful for your client. So
Yeah,
hopefully,
sorry, just before we wrap up, I was going to say one of the questions I particularly like, is there anything else that you haven't shared so far that you think would be useful or valuable for our work together?
yeah.
And it's really amazing what clients will put in there. Sometimes they drop a huge clanger of something that is clearly relevant, that they've managed to answer the whole questionnaire and haven't covered it. And sometimes they might just, they might leave it blank, or they might just put, this was really challenging for me to start, or I'm really nervous about this. It's a really lovely question to kind of get a steer from where your clients starting from.
And sometimes in that section, the client will put, I'm currently undergoing therapy or in therapy, which I really enjoy and I'm getting a lot from. And I see coaching as being like a supplement to this. You might even choose to have a question in your pre-coaching questionnaire, if you don't already ask it in your chemistry conversation, around, what other support do you have in your life to enable you to achieve the goals that you've set for yourself? And that could just help to create that sort of picture of what the client has around them in terms of support. So, you're one piece of that jigsaw for the client.
Absolutely.
So there's
So
lots more questions. And so I could chat for hours about it, because different questions pop up, and you probably have had some questions pop up in your own mind as you've been listening to the podcast. You're probably wanting to share them with us. So if you would like to access the free download with those 100 questions you can use in a pre-coaching questionnaire, then you can download that from igcompany.co.uk/PCQ.
yeah, thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.